Welcome everyone to our first symposium of the year with Dana Johnson going over the topic of understanding and supporting people in the LGBTQ plus community. I also, before we got started, I wanted to introduce you to Ashley Espinoza, which is going to be the new project manager for CVCA. So I'd love to hand it off to her to do a brief introduction.
Hello, everyone. My name is Ashley. You can call me Ash for short. My pronouns are she, her, hers. And yes, I'm the new project manager, and I'm excited to be here and work with all of you. So, just to share a little bit about me, I joined at CAPC earlier this year, and I was supporting the Foster Youth Initiative AmeriCorps program, Black Infant Health and Safe Sleep Baby programs, with the along with this role. So before coming to CAP Center, I was with NAMI California, where I managed statewide mental health programs. Overall, I'm very passionate about this type of work, and I look forward to continuing to support trauma-informed practices that strengthen outcomes for children and families. So I know that many of you have been connected with this work for a very long time, and I'm looking forward to learning alongside you and continuing this very incredible work that is very seen, and I can see the work that you guys all do from Sadie. So thank you for having me. And we'll go to the next slide. So here's some, before we get started, we just want to go through some quick Zoom housekeeping items. So first, please make sure that your microphone stays muted unless you're speaking, and this will help reduce background noise and keep things clear for everybody. So just keep that on check at the bottom of your screen. Feel free to use the chat and the QA box throughout our time together here. Both will be monitored, so drop any questions or comments in there and we'll keep check of them. And we are also recording today's presentation for internal purposes, and we'll be sharing the slides and recording with you all afterwards. And lastly, you're welcome to use the other Zoom features like the raise your hand option and the little reactions that they have. So for today's session, we are focused on understanding and supporting people, and specifically the LGBTQIA2S plus community. And we have invited an incredible speaker who brings valuable knowledge with lived experience in this space. I'm honored to introduce you to Dana Johnson, who joins us from Wisconsin. And Dana is a career social worker with extensive experience in senior management roles in state government and county human services, as well as work as an educator in higher education and the operator of consulting and professional development firm. Dana's background includes child welfare practice, policy and reform, transformational leadership and organizational cultural change, team supervision, continuous quality improvement, and equity, diversity, and inclusion efforts across micro, meso, and macro system. In addition to his professional work, Dana is also a lead organizer for the Fox Valley Pride in Wisconsin, a cultural and social organization supporting the LGBTQ plus community through monthly events, advocacy, and an annual Pride Festival. So please join me in extending a warm welcome to Dana Johnson for being here with us today. The floor is yours.
Thanks, Ash. Thanks, Sadie, for having me. Good morning, everyone. It is so good to be with you. And I am, in fact, Dana Johnson from Wisconsin. And if you want to like me on Instagram, that is my Instagram handle. So it is good to be together. And I'm just so glad we have so many folks here from both child welfare and how you support the child welfare system, as well as perhaps people that would identify here in the LGBTQIA+ community. And today is an opportunity for conversation. A lot of you probably have even more experience than I do working, whether it's with youth or with parents or with the system in general, and trying to support children and families that might fall into these categories. And so happy to just, anytime you want to share something that you've learned in your career and give us a little gold nugget, feel free to do that. Feel free to unmute yourself or throw something into the chat, and we'll be together. We'll also, just kind of make this an opportunity. I pulled some interesting learning pieces. I've got some history today in our presentation. And then later, I do want to do some comparison on policy and things that might actually be impacting families. I'm going to show you like the California way and then the Wisconsin way, and just kind of show you a report card from the Human Rights Campaign about how we're doing, these days in supporting folks. Also, I'm giving you my digits, so to speak, email and things. If there's something that comes up today and you want to dive a little deeper or have a conversation post the symposium today, happy to continue the conversation. And so thanks for the great introduction, Ash. So right now, I do not represent this organization that I'm about to tell you during this session, but I do currently work for the Department of Children and Families here in Wisconsin. My role is primarily in strategic initiatives. I write a lot of administrative rules and work on essentially child welfare transformation. And one of the spaces that is in my portfolio right now tends to be how to support youth that identify in this population. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what has occurred with us, both in foster care, group home care, residential care centers and things, and even some sticky points that I've been experiencing even in my career. And then I'll just share some things that have happened over my lifetime. I do identify, as you can see, there's my husband and my little family of dogs in the LGBTQ community. I do identify as gay. So I might bring in some stories from my own personal experience and, of course, the work in child welfare. I have spent most of my career in the field of child welfare, and so have a lot of perspective there, but of course, community work, advocacy, and things like that. And so that's what we're going to do today. We're going to talk about how we support different folks, and we're going to take a look at the micro, meso, and macro spaces of those. We'll take a look at what it's like to really have cultural competence, as a word thrown out there. Obviously, we prefer cultural humility, but also learning those terms and some things in there. We'll probably gloss over some of that because we have a lot of experienced folks here, but just want to, give you that. We'll also take a look at that trauma-informed perspective. In fact, in Wisconsin, I was part of the first trauma-informed care initiative at one of our counties. We were kind of the forefront runners of that, and we borrowed actually from the Magnolia Project out in LA. So it was, and that was years ago, I think almost like 12 years ago. So it's really interesting to think about how we use trauma-informed healing, particularly with families who might identify in this space. So those are all the things we're going to do. We're going to talk a little bit about the struggles and how we support people, and then get into some of the science behind identity development. So let's just start with the words, right? You probably know most of the words that are on the screen here, but the one thing that a lot of people, when they think about, kind of the LGBTQ, IHOS plus community, is that they often don't know the full definitions. They only know like, okay, homosexual means that I am interested in the person that is like me, right? The same, whether it's the same gender expression or gender identity, etc. But what's interesting is the actual definition talks about emotional connection. It talks about romantic connection. It talks about sexual attraction connection. And so people don't often recognize that there are multiple facets to it. In fact, we might even see it in some of the Facebook comments that we get, like, oh, why can't you just keep that into your bedroom and no longer talk about it or have this, experience to our children? And I'm like, it's more than just what happens behind that one particular closed door. And so, again, if we look around this wheel, we know that bisexuality means we have that emotional, romantic, and sexual attractions to people of two different genders. Perhaps transgender are individuals that identify within a gender spectrum. And we'll talk about the spectrum and how it's widened over years, and how brain science is teaching us, in fact, that it's more actual prevalent because we actually have labels to it now, where before we just kind of let those labels and those words go to the side because there was so much pressure to not be something. And so it's really been interesting to see how something, also a word, can be so jarring for so many people, particularly in the child welfare system. And again, when we think about transgender, we think about the identity differs from those original kind of social expectations of the biological sex of that particular being. And if you recall, way back in the day, there were terms around this, around transsexuality. If you even go back to like transvestites and you think about Rocky Horror Picture Show, when we think about those individuals that used to identify, those were folks that had that gender that might have been different than what they were essentially assigned or what's on their birth certificate. So also recognizing we've interchanged terms for a long time. And also, we used to say things like sexuality versus gender, and we do know there is a difference, but just recognizing some people don't. And so, as we become more versed in this language, helping people understand some of those differences. In fact, the Supreme Court, if you remember, under Ruth Bader Ginsburg, talked about the idea that sex and gender, based on the Supreme Court, were technically one in the same where some social scientists like to differentiate both. So it's really interesting to see that play out even in policy. And then last but not least, on here we have both intersexuality and pansexuality. And just that idea, intersexual individuals are people who are born with their chromosomes, their gonads, their actual physical beings, and potentially their anatomical parts are kind of ambiguous, right? And so they're considered intersexed individuals. Actually, 4% of the people on the planet are born into that. And so that, though, is the development, and then we move through identity development later, of course. And then pansexual, just that whole spectrum, right? That idea that people can identify here one day, the next over here, based on their own kind of self-disclosure, their own comfort with who they are, those sorts of things. So if those are new terms for you, welcome to the party. It's always good to know. And terms are changing all the time. In fact, when I was in higher ed, I couldn't keep up. I was always like, "Oh, what's the new lingo today in this space?" We also know that there are terms, particularly in this community, that are sometimes referred to as kind of a negative connotation, but are often embraced by communities who face oppression. One of those on the screen here is queer. And just that idea, when we think about it, it's someone who does not conform to kind of the normative in society. But even myself, I'll often say when I'm referencing a speech or I'm in a community full of folks that are part of the LGBTQIA2+ community, I'll just say us queer folks, right? So I'll say us queer folks or the queer community, because then I get the whole encompassing piece. But just recognizing there are many people that will self-identify. And the one thing I often teach a lot of our youth care workers in the state of Wisconsin is really thinking about, we give the term that the person identifies. We don't assign a term, we wait for them to tell us what they are. And that just solves most of the issues with people's apprehensions in those spaces. And I also want to, if we go back, way back in the day, we even used to use the term cross-dresser. We don't use that as much anymore, but that was the way in which kind of society first embraced this idea that gender expression and identity might be different, because most people look at clothing as something very important, not only in their expression, but also how we just go about the world. And so looking through that and recognizing we used to also use that term as well. And many of you are also probably familiar with the Two-Spirited community, right? This is from our Native American, First Nation, Indigenous folks. And to be honest, dates back, 5,000 years ago that people were given this term. It wasn't quite called Two-Spirit in the way that it is in the English translation, but just like recognizing that there are communities, Indigenous peoples of this world, who have considered people in the queer community in particular as being some kind of connected being to both people present, and whether it's the gods or the spirit or the energy of earth, and kind of having this almost healing power, having wisdom that might be on the ages, and being celebrated in that space. And you can learn a lot about that if you go to the Indian Health services. They have a lot of information related to the Two-Spirited community. But what I love about it is it celebrates the culture, right? And it celebrates the concept that people can be who they are and bring something that most people in Western society would see as negative, And they just kind of got it. They just kind of, made it part of their culture and society in a much faster way than some in kind of Western culture. And again, two-spirit identity was that idea that there might be this supernatural intervention that occurred for them when they were born, and that as they kind of came into their identity, even some talk about visions and dreams to where they were selected, and often were shamans or were spiritual healers within their community to help support and even take on varied, at that time, kind of gender roles based in that space. So that's kind of the beginning of our topic with just some, grounding on some of the, language. Any questions? Anyone want to add anything? Anything that they've also been hearing lately and get some new language out there for us? Any questions? I will share an interesting piece. This is, part of the child welfare connection I'm going to make today. We work very closely in Wisconsin. Our government recognizes the 12 federally recognized tribes, and so we work quite hand in hand with the 12 tribes that happen to be in Wisconsin. Particularly in child welfare, because they have most of them have a separate tribal court. Some actually have health and human service organizations. Others rely kind of on more so like a case manager, but don't have the full organization. But what was really interesting is we recently revised our foster care rule, which says how people can be licensed to be a foster parent. And they were instrumental in two aspects. One, we joined the list of about 20 states that now allow like kin relationships and relative to be defined as someone who has a strong emotional attachment or bond with a child. And it allows people who aren't, through marriage or blood to technically be related and be able to care for kids who enter our formal child welfare system. What was interesting when we revised the foster care rule is there was some concern because the normal person kind of out in the community would say that differing gendered individuals should not share bedrooms. This has been like a normal thing in foster care, which I find fascinating because as someone who grew up with step siblings, I had shared kind of the same living space as my stepsister and my stepbrother and those sorts of things. But it was interesting when we were writing rule that people had a lot of assumptions around the fact that differing gendered people should not share bedrooms. And it was really helpful to have our tribes come in and talk about the two-spirited culture to some of the people that were helping us develop and revise the rule. So our new rule took effect December 1st. It took me 3 years to work through that with our community partners, but ultimately we remove gender and gender assignment to where and how kids can sleep. So we allow much more flexibility. There's consent required. And those are spaces I just want to share with you because some states are still lagging kind of behind in that and really thinking outside the box in that concept. And to be honest, the whole idea originally where we were getting lots of pushback in this space was that if you place people that are opposite essentially gender in the same room, there would be somehow some kind of sexual abuse or, exploration that would happen. And I just kind of raised my hand and I said, do you think that that is what did not happen to me if you placed a male who might also be gay in the room with me? I was like, no, I probably, so it didn't matter. Like that doesn't compute when you think about it, because if I'm gay, most likely I would want an actual male and they're not going to put a female in my room. So it's also very interesting how Western society likes to kind of think incorrectly in some of those spaces. Um, we'll move on here. So gender identity, right? The word here that's your internal sense of belonging, your internal sense of how you feel as a person. Obviously, we know that there was the dichotomy for years and years and years between male and female, and we know that that simply was never in existence. There's always been more than two. We've just always put those two at the top of the list. And then how we express is very different than perhaps how we identify. And so recognizing that that could be clothing, hairstyle, behavior, those sorts of things. Very similarly, we did this in foster care rule as well, where we worked with our tribes and wanted to make sure that kids who entered foster care would be able to have a better sense of identity, because we know that a lot of LGBTQIA2S plus identifying youth will come into care because of oppression they're facing, even from their own parents or their family. And so we wrote in our admin rule recently that hair care decisions, right, that foster parents cannot make hair care decisions for children unless there's a consult with both the child and consult with the Indian custodian and the tribe and potentially the biological parents or whoever was their caregiver. And a child who's 12 or older can simply consent for themselves. And so that was really a way for us to affirm maybe perhaps a 12-year-old who was coming into foster care who identified self as a male, for example, but parents were treating them as though they were a female, and their hair care is part of their identity. So that's one way we started to support kids a little bit differently here. And then also recognizing originally that the Supreme Court and how we identified society, sex was kind of the base. And if you think about it, sex is the phrase that we often use on, IDs. It'll be interesting to see if we change. We originally, with the Supreme Court ruling, people were moving from having sex be the identified category to gender being the identified category, and that was going to allow some space for us to grow and be more inclusive. It'll be interesting to see if the feds decide to flip back to the original part, which is that sex assigned at birth, and if they change the categories essentially. In Wisconsin, we've been talking about this with our child welfare system as well, like our database. Originally, we were planning to allow caseworkers, case managers to essentially assign the LGBTQ marker in our database so that as children move through our system, they wouldn't have to retell their story. Or when we were trying to find placements, we'd be able to know, the pronouns of someone, how this youth identified. And we thought it would make things a little easier to help support. But what we found is, if you recall things that have happened in Texas in the last year and a half, where they started to essentially pull information from those databases related to those sex markers and that identification of LGBTQIA+ from their databases, and then started to essentially file criminal negligent complaints or child abuse complaints against parents or foster parents or the system that was supporting those identity development and identity markers. And so Wisconsin decided, we're worried about how that information could be used against kids and families. So we removed that from a future project, which was really sad because we were working on that build for several years to make it positive. And I know I'm being a little bit of a Debbie Downer or a Dana Downer at the moment, but that's like the reality of where we're at, right? And so like recognizing I want to support kids, but then I'm worried that that could be used against them by, a politician who views the world separate, in a separate kind of dichotomy. So also highlighting, how does California stand? How does your local community stand? What kind of information do we take in, particularly in social work, and how can it be used against people in these spaces? Any other thoughts to add to that conversation or this identity here, these words on the screen? Or questions about that work? Okay, I'll keep going. If you are not aware of the Gender Unicorn, this is a wonderful tool, particularly when we're working with youth. This was actually developed by the TSER, which is part of the Trans Network to help with school and education resources. So this was a really great way they've introduced the Gender Unicorn, particularly in school districts. But it helps us identify that there's actually, and this is the one thing I love about this one, is it's great for adults who just like they kind of don't get it, right? I'm working with a lot of group homes and residential care centers right now, and they just don't really, there's some that just don't get it. And so, like, helping them separate out the difference between identity, which has this gender piece, and then the expression, which comes out in all mannerisms and very, how that can be itself different than the actual identity. And then helping people understand that just because an assignment by a physician or an assignment based on your human genome doesn't always actually, it's not always right. Let's also be honest there. But that it doesn't necessarily, there are lots of chemicals that happen in our brain that we don't necessarily put forward into the world, but it's still there and it exists. And so it's been interesting to have that conversation with people that does your blood type actually matter at the end of the day? Most people would say no, unless you're going to donate. So what does the anatomical part actually do for you at the end of the day? And then the other pieces, right, that people can identify or express in one space, but then have an attraction or an emotional attraction to folks who might be different, and that none of those are actually, you can't link them. They're all independent variables. And so some people want, they just think if you're heterosexual, you have to be the piece assigned at birth and kids have to express a certain way. And so I talk about it in that space of independent variables. And so just recognizing that. And it's funny when I tell people that they're cisgender, they think I'm offending them. And I'm like, well, are you not the way, or do you not express the way in which you were born? Do you not identify in the way in which you were born? So it's kind of funny. It's a running joke we have kind of in our little community. I'm like, oh, you're cisgender. And they're like, don't call me names. I'm like, okay, I'm just saying. And if you're not into all the things, these are all of we call this the trans binary, the trans umbrella, but recognizing there's not just a binary any longer, particularly in social sciences, but recognize these are all the words that are in this umbrella. And so if there are ones that are, new to you here, just recognizing ambigender is the kind of the space that we often see like ambidextrous, right? That gender was both one side or another. Gender queer, we've been hearing kind of on the rise as well, where people will say, my gender is queer, and then I have a different sexuality or sexual expression, those sorts of things. New choice was a word used kind of out of the University of Cambridge, which was some studies done related to how human psychology begins to think about this idea that you can be neutral in your gender, and that gender is all of the things, that emotional, romantic, sexual, and then how you express it. So new choice was kind of that neutral space. And you can see all of the other ones that are on here. Sometimes we'll hear people say like, I'm FTM, right? I'm female transitioning to male, or I'm MTF, male transitioning to female, those sorts of things. So just want to highlight some of those. And agender, if you think about that, when people look at themselves as not prescribing to any sort of gender, right? And we also know in the LGBTQIA+ community that a lot of folks really kind of balk at the idea that someone else is going to assign something to them. And so we use these terms to essentially say, I'm not going to follow the requirements, those social requirements that you've asked me to be, or those roles that you've assigned me from birth. Like at gender reveal parties, where one of those things that I'm like, are you sure you want to put all that weight on pink or blue? Because what if there's yellow or green or any other color? And it's one of those things I'm like, there's a lot of pressure that, especially in Western society, place on that early, identifier. What's the gender of the baby? Everyone wants to know. It's also fabulous. We call it the baby, but anyway, it's a whole nother platform. I'm like, oh, we talk about it. Oh, the baby. Oh, the baby's down for. I'm like, you mean Thomas? You mean Claire? I don't know. It's just like the baby. It's just kind of funny. So just want to identify that. And they're adding, like I could probably add 5 more to that slide probably tomorrow, right? So knowing that things change and it's up to us to keep keep up to speed. Pronouns, you probably hear about this all the time. What's in a pronoun? I got to tell you, being a guy named Dana, I get misgendered all the time, right? And I even have kind of a higher speaking voice, particularly when I'm on the phone. And it's funny because I even get it when I call my own doctor's office. I'm like, you asked me for my date of birth, you asked me for my name, you got the chart open in front of you. How can you still misgender me? They don't misgender me when I show up, though, because I look and express male. But it's interesting that happens, and I don't take a lot of offense to it, but I find it fascinating, especially when I travel with my partner and we show up in a foreign country, and they're like, "Oh, did you want two beds?" And then I have to explain the whole whatever. But recognizing that personal pronouns can be really important and they can be very triggering. And the number one recommendation I meet with people who just seem to struggle with this, right? They, them, trying to tell someone who might be identifying as they, them, or one of these others, fae, fair, those sorts of things, which, by the way, stems from Greek mythology, the fae kind of space. And even if you're a big fan of like Lord of the Rings and stuff like that, fae was also used for like elves and kind of this higher group of people with higher intellect. So if you're wondering where some of these things come from, they're actually very old. They're just being reintroduced into the mainstream. But I often say for folks that just can't get the pronouns right, I'm like, just use their name. Super simple tactic, right? So instead of saying he or she, just say Emmett or Dana. Dana's going to go to the store. Dana's coming over later, not he, right? And it's so much easier to just use insert name. And what's in a pronoun? A lot of people will say, well, why does it matter? It matters. I mean, think about it. Would you want to constantly be called something you were not? Even if it could be this, right? I don't really, I'm not a Mrs., right? I identify strongly with my male identity. And so recognizing that it just causes me to think, honestly, that you're an idiot and then also not consider it. But at the end of the day, hopefully we get past all that. And that's been a rather interesting thing. Also knowing that these pronouns change. And I remember in higher ed, for example, we had some individuals who were writing like their social work entry essays and things. And we wanted to demark or forget, I'm so sorry, I'm forgetting the term, but essentially we didn't want to know people's names and we didn't want to know people's gender or sexual orientation at the time because we wanted to be able to enter people into the program without any bias. And I remember when we started getting essays with they, which was actually recommended that people do that instead of he or she, or ask for letters of references where people didn't put those salutations. And it was kind of at the forefront. I was really surprised that our university was doing it because we were the University of Wisconsin Green Bay, which is not so liberal in its respect. But it was interesting because then there was this big discussion around isn't they plural? And actually, the Oxford Dictionary from the University of Oxford says that they is singular. So you can let people know that when you have your holiday gatherings, in case people are wondering. Any other things that you want to add about pronouns? Maybe you know.
Um, I I had a question about it because I know like ever since COVID happened and we had more of these Zoom meetings and you would have in your introductions, introduce yourself, say your pronouns and your job or whatever it is. And it would make me a little uncomfortable to have to like say my pronouns just because it was new to me. But then I was like, well, if I don't say them, am I offending other people by not saying my own pronouns? So I wanted to get your thoughts on it.
Yeah, it's interesting. I thought I actually had renamed myself when I came in, but for some reason the he, him didn't show up. I think for me, I'm not offended when people don't because it's an extra thing that people hadn't had to think about. We weren't socialized to introduce ourselves with a pronoun. And in fact, when I don't even introduce myself like Mr. Dana Johnson, like I just say, "Hi, I'm Dana Johnson." And I think but what's important though is like as someone who knows that there are people that feel whether they're oppressed or forgotten, um, or they don't know who to trust, right? As they're coming out into the world, when I see he, him in one of these spaces, I know that this person is an ally, or I know that this person gets it. Or the same thing in my email signature. My email signature at work says he, him. And I get questions every now and again about it. But what it does, it says I'm an ally. Now, of course, people could do it to make sure they don't feel like they're left out, but and not know. But I usually that's like raising the pride flag for me that says this person is welcoming. Um, so I think it's up. Yeah, I guess that's all I would say. I would say that it's helpful to do it. And I also think as we move through this idea that pronouns could grow as well, staying versed in it will be helpful because there are times that people don't want to be a cultural informant. And so if you hear someone say fey, fey, or fey, you know, it's really up to us to know what that is. It's not up to that person to always have to explain that, if that makes sense.
Well, that's helpful. Thank you.
Yeah. I also think it's important that we don't muddy too much of the, kind of muddy the waters here too much by creating too many. Also, like we don't want people that make fun of it and say, well, I'll just call you apple or orange or those sorts of things. Because I think at the end of the day, that's actually offensive to do that. And so we also have to point that out. Sometimes I'll even hear people struggle over LGBTQIA2S plus, and then they'll say things to me like, oh, the alphabet soup. And I'm like, ooh, I don't, that's like saying another word for someone else's culture, right? If you said a slur for, someone in the Japanese culture, for example, you wouldn't get away with that. So part of me is also helping to educate people when they say things like that. I even had my administrator struggle over LGBTQIA2S plus. And I said, if you're struggling over that, you need to say it more. You need to practice. Because I don't struggle over certain words, in society. Like I've learned to say them right. I look them up. I ask Apple to say them to me so that next time I'm talking with someone in a foreign language, I don't, mispronounce the name of the city they're from, for example, because that's important. Any other thoughts? All right. Well, let's get into some of the science, right? So again, depending on your roles, I know a lot of us have had, child development courses and human behavior in the social environment if you're a social worker in particular. But recognizing that identity formation is the number one thing we tend to be working on when we're working particularly youth and child welfare, but we're often helping parents understand that identity formation, right? So when I came out when I was 17, and I have a whole story about this later, but I came out and knew and explained to the world that I was a certain identity. I had always known, though, since about five, that I was different or that I happened to have sort of a natural attraction to males. Even though I came out as a bisexual, part of that was the pressure of society. Grandma always saying, when are you going to marry that girl, Sarah, that you really like? And are you going to have kids? And aren't you going to join the Navy like your, grandfather? And like all, kind of all that pressure. So I want to talk about, though, how kids develop that identity and what we've been seeing, particularly when people say, well, there seems to be a lot more kids who are identified as trans these days, or a lot more kids who identify in the gay community. Well, one, there's more people on the planet, so that makes sense. Two, because we have spaces where it is supported, there are going to be more. Plus, when we all have common language around it, that identity development becomes something easily discussed as well as researched. So the more we know, the more it is prevalent. So I also think it's important to recognize that I'm often combating people's, thoughts around, well, it's because we have it, and if we didn't have it, nobody would be it. And it's like, no, they would. They would. They just would feel oppressed all the time. And we don't want that either. So when we think about this, Diagelli actually, 1994, he released kind of this big body of research around placing identity in these different categories, but the categories are more around the actual development milestones of how people reach an identity. So he started with the idea that people often have to develop internally themselves, like what is my identity? And it's similar to when people decide they like a certain color or food or want to be Buddhist or whatever it might be. They themselves research what that is, they have feelings towards what something is, and they gain an affinity. So there's like a personal status. The second part is then they have to identify what's called from a social identity. So personal identity, then they get into a social identity. And the social identity is how we socialize with other people. So the next step then is trying to figure out, are there indeed other people that I can socialize? And, I was born in the 80s. 81 to be exact. And I remember growing up and thinking there are no other kids like me except maybe these kids that are hanging out with me. Maybe they are. I'm not really sure if they have these same feelings. So they start developing questions with their peers or they want to engage in learning. Luckily, you could debate this too. Social media, the internet has allowed youth essentially to be able to find this identity maybe faster. And again, it allows people to have better conversation. Now, again, perhaps social media might be the worst and best invention ever, but who knows? And then the third kind of process Diagelli tells us is what he says developing as an offspring. Sometimes as a queer or gay man, I have to look at myself with my siblings. Now again, I told you I have step siblings. I don't have biological siblings, but I now have to maybe switch from being heterosexual brother Dana to being gay Dana, gay brother Dana. Or if I identify as trans, like, or I change, to a differing gender, like recognizing that I have to create a new identity even with my own siblings. And we also know that some siblings don't agree, right? And it's hard to say you don't agree with someone, but that's essentially what they're doing and agreeing with that identity. And they also struggle with trying to see someone as a different identity because they've known them as someone else. And I love this line, and it might even be in one of the slides here, but someone on TV famously said, "Oh, why do you feel like you need to be a man now?" And the actor responded and said, "No, honey, I've been dressing up as a woman my whole life. This is actually me." And it's like, oh, like that. Okay, so I was playing dress up the whole time. And so that's like a really cool way to think about that identity status. The fourth kind of place Diagelli tells us is then about intimacy, when we get more intimate with folks, whether that's a sexual and attraction relationship or just, a deeper relationship. But sometimes intimacy status is also dependent, and that identity is dependent upon those other individuals, right? So sometimes I might want to be more intimate with someone who I think would identify in a similar category as me. But Diagelli says that intimacy status, that identity can be harmed by other people saying essentially you shouldn't do that or you shouldn't be part of that, or closing out children, for example, from knowing about those different types of the LGBTQ spectrum, essentially, or not helping them find people that are similar to them. And then the last kind of area, and Diagelli put these in stages. I like to think that they're just steps and you can take them in any order. But Diagelli has said that you enter the community. You go out and you find that community, and you kind of open the closet, so to speak, and enter into it. And what's interesting is in youth in particular, they might not know what that is. And as adults, we have to be that person to do that. And I find in child welfare, this is tricky because there are times that youth come, into the system. I'm aware of this identity status. But I want to introduce them to this community that they have, but maybe a foster parent isn't comfortable with that. Or maybe the biological or original caregiver was also not comfortable with that. But then who is my client? Who do I help assist? Is it the child? Is it the parent? And who gets to decide some of that? So I think that's a struggle I've had a lot in my career, is around helping those individuals actually find their community, particularly in some areas where I live in Wisconsin, where it's clear that this location is very accepting, but once you kind of get out into the countryside, it might be more difficult. Most of our foster homes often tend to be in those communities. So any questions on the Diagelli model? He originally also developed this idea too of sexual well, he didn't do it, but he talks about that sexual orientation, that idea that we orient ourselves with a sexual experience is different than how we orient ourselves with a gender identity. So he was one of the, in the 90s, kind of that first that said there's a split there. And I was like, oh, that's fascinating, to think about that. And his work stems from Kinsey, Alfred Kinsey, and Evelyn Hooker, who was one of the first social scientists to really do a big study about how people find attraction and develop in that space. Questions, things you want to add here, things you might be seeing in child welfare related to this identity formation, identity status, or if you're a counselor and what you see in youth or kids when they're trying to think about these things, or tips and tricks to help youth explore. And for some, maybe this is like a refresher course too, which it might very well be. And you're like, oh, I know this, Dana, that's good too. But thanks for coming too. And also, I think research itself in this space, it's kind of sad. It has stalled. And I think it'll be interesting to see like we might end up with more research coming out of places like Thailand, or perhaps, Europe, and some of the places where health and research continue to be funded. We do know in the United States that area is kind of off limits at this point. And so we won't be able to continue to study that unless we have national endowments that are, funded by private philanthropists and things. So also recognizing this will be an interesting, probably decade of lack of research into furthering these social movements. All right. So I often, I will say too, a lot of my audience tends to be folks that either this is a newer concept, and they just don't recognize necessarily. They're like, oh, are people born this way? Do they become this way? How do they determine these sorts of things? So I'm going to kind of walk through some of those things that happen, right, with kids. And so when we think about just general human development, think about how you grew up, right? Maybe you identify in this community, but how did you come to terms with who you are? And so we think about this idea that a lot of us learn from behavioral modeling. And so I shared with you earlier this idea, if we have these gender reveal parties, for example, and we're kind of pigeonholing kids into this gender, we often assign that gender then to that color, which assigns them to stuffed animals, assigns them to, hobbies, or, these kids get bikes, and these kids get GI Joes, and these kids get dolls, and which, by the way, a GI Joe is a doll, let's just be honest, just a different gender doll. But recognizing, like, at the end of the day, we force kids into that space. And so then we also model it, right? There's a lot of times I remember growing up, and I ended up having family members who identified in this community, but nobody knew. And once people knew, they weren't allowed to come to Christmas anymore. In fact, I remember when I had my first kind of long-term partner in my early 20s, and I wanted to come home for Christmas, the family was like, well, we've got kids. So you can come by yourself, but you can't come with them because we don't want them around. Now that's changed a little bit with my family, a couple of folks, but there's also some religion that's in there. But recognizing, like, that's still there today, like that idea that you cannot be who you are, and that we often tell people they shouldn't be around or be modeling that type of behavior. We also know that there's message intake, and I'm going to show you some of those things from advertisements. I think about this time of year, I can't get away from every kiss begins with K. Do you guys get those, commercials all the time? All I see are heterosexuals. What I love is when I walk down the jet bridgeway for Delta Airlines and I see two men sitting together in what I assume is probably a gay relationship. And I am like, yes, Delta, you get all my money when I fly, because you actually show that there are people like me that exist. And sometimes that's all that matters. And so there is this message intake of kids where they don't get to see that, particularly as, we ban books, or we don't and we see this too with multicultural families. I think about that, even on our own website where I work, I'm like, do we have families of color? Do we have families that look like they're LGBTQI2S plus? Now, again, you have to use a lot of stereotypes to do that, but are we actually promoting that, or are we just using stock photos of those sorts of things? We also know that clothing, toys, I talked about touching, hugging. Boys are told not to cry. Oftentimes we can't. Two boys hugging would be weird for a lot of parents versus the opposite. If you were male and female, that would be easy. But if you remember too, I remember in high school, right? When you think about homecoming dance, there was a discount if you went with someone. And I could never say I was going to go with Billy, right? It just was not going to happen. So we would get two solo tickets, and so there's often discounts and things like that, or children are kind of modeled or told that they're supposed to go in a certain way in those spaces. So I just want to highlight a lot kind of comes from that experience of how the world shapes us in that space. So one of the things I ask whether it's people in child welfare, like these providers, like group homes and things like that, but then also foster parents when we do training and we think about what their home is like. I ask them to really think about what are those messages? What are ways in which you can add things to your environment to be more inclusive? Or how do we add those things to our mission statement? Or do you allow, like group homes is another one. I'm like, we're finding youth in group homes, because there's also a higher number now of LGBTQIA2S plus youth entering group homes, is that they're like, I want to go to a Pride Fest. Why don't you take me to a Pride Fest? Or why don't you take me, to a Juneteenth, a festival and things. And for some reason, that just seems to be really difficult. But they're happy to take them, to the Memorial Day parade, which is fascinating. And so, like thinking through how policy could shape to require those sorts of things. Technically, from the federal government, we have what's called a reasonable prudent parent standard, which does require that people have exposure to not only their own culture, but to other cultures that those youth are desiring. But depending on where you are in your community, it might be, very hegemonic or, kind of one particular culture. And they actually have to spend some time and money and thought in planning that out for kids. This is the new space that we're finding around spectrums, right? And the spectrums of both romantic orientation and sexual orientation. So again, I like to talk about this when we think about supporting kids. Because a lot of times we like to think that there's like a category drop down. You're either this or this or this or this, and like that's the label. It's also funny when people are like, well, why do we need all these labels? And I'm like, well, if I'm going to make green bean casserole for a holiday and I go to the soup aisle and all the cans have no labels, how do I know that the soup that I want to have in my green bean casserole, which is cream of mushroom for those that have never had it, right? I need cream of mushroom because that's what I'm looking for. That's what I want. And I need that as an ingredient. So I need the label because I don't want to get it wrong. Because tomato soup in a green bean casserole, it's going to not be good. And so recognizing like this is actually a really cool way of spectrums, this idea that no one's like in the drop down category box, everyone's a little different. And I love it because I even think about my heterosexual friends, right, that express in the gender that they were born in. And I think to myself, you all are actually a little different because I got to tell you, you might have done some things or had attraction to this person, which is now, different than who you are now. And you might have done this with this or had these emotional connections with someone and you couldn't quite put your finger on it. But and I think that if we start thinking about it on a spectrum space, it's good. So this is like one of those things to consider, as an education point. And I'm giving you these as like go research more of these things to add to your tool belt. But oftentimes people don't know the ACE spectrum or the arrow spectrum. So the arrow spectrum is like people who are demi-romantic, either people who have kind of this romantic or social expectation that there might be multiple people at the same time. And so recognizing this seems to, again, this has always been around. In fact, if you were to watch television, you would have seen this like on Rome and some of those, old time period pieces, but where a lot of times people will have a relationship and be married or be in an experience with one and then have something on the side. And this, I would say that they are demi-romantic. They're demisexual in that point. Now, they wouldn't identify, they might call themselves bisexual, but I think when we get in this spectrum space, then we're not always just throwing ourselves in the drop down. And then we have folks that are kind of aromantic, where they never really want to have a romantic relationship, or maybe they're in the asexual or the ace space where they don't ever want to have a sexual relationship. In fact, they just might just want to have a romantic. And I think that that's really interesting because we don't think about that with kids. The normal human system is the idea that you have to procreate and create something new. And so I think it's interesting as we start allowing or having research out there that there are many beings that don't do this. In fact, there are plants is one of them. We do know that for like worms and insects and even penguins, right? There are so many species on the planet that don't engage and they only engage in, some experiences to further their species and some don't ever, or they have multiple partners because that's the way that they were made and exist and grow. So recognizing that humans are no different, we just socialize different. So I just wanted to highlight that maybe a different way to think about instead of categories, spectrums. Thoughts here or questions?
I think a lot of people don't want to explore the spectrum, right? They want the binary, they want a solid black and white answer. And it's scary. Or when their kid comes and says something to them like, oh, is my kid different? What does that mean going forward? But I think that sometimes stops them from educating themselves in a way, right? Like they're too
Yeah.
scared to acknowledge it.
Well, and I think, Teresina, like that same belief, then if a child comes and says, well, I think I might be this, and then they're like, okay, well, let's go get you pink clothes, for example. And I'm like, well, maybe that's not the answer. Maybe they
Yeah.
just want something that might be more effeminate or affirming or different looking, but you don't have to go from one to the other. So I think we can do some damage sometimes. And then it actually, when they decide they want to be more on this side or in the middle, then there's this constant like, well, we'll just pick something, and then it ends up hurting their identity development versus if we were just to say, well, let's just go to the store and you just pick out what you like versus I'm going to go buy pink or I'm going to buy blue or, those sorts of things. So that's why I love this little spectrum. So, and it's funny too, what you just said, because I think just having this conversation with someone yesterday that a lot of people will say, well, if I can't see it, it's not true or it's not what I see must be the truth rather than what someone believes. And I find that interesting because they'll say that in this respect that, well, whatever you express is who you are, rather than the fact that I could have multiple layers to that or this spectrum. But if someone were to tell me if they believe in God, the God, the heaven and the earth sort of God, I would say, well, can you see it? And it's interesting because that conversation changes suddenly because then they're like, well, it's faith. And I'm like, okay, well, kind of identity status is faith. It's faith in myself. It's faith in the idea that I have these facets that are on a spectrum. And it's been interesting to kind of help people see that as you don't always have to see it to believe it. And a lot of people, kind of question it. It's kind of interesting way to put it. So. All right. So one of the things again, I told you like I knew at like 5 and then I was like at 8 and 12 and like I kind of had these patterns where I was constantly thinking I liked men or boys at the time, we were boys. But eventually, society was telling me, "Ooh, I don't know, that's really bad" and things. So eventually when I came out, it was kind of an interesting moment. This is mom. It was kind of an interesting moment for me, and I'm just going to read you what this was like so you can kind of, again, maybe you're part of this community or maybe you haven't necessarily had a child, come out to you, but this is what it was like with my mom. So this is my mom talking. By the way, it's like 2 in the morning. I'm crying on the couch, junior year of high school. She comes out of the bedroom, and she says, "So you're confused. That's okay. We will still love you. It'll be hard to tell your dad. Are you sure about this? We'll have to wait to tell grandma. Have you told anyone else? Does it mean you still like Sarah? Or what about Darren? Does he know? Do you love him? Will it be okay at school? What about at work? Does anyone tease you? They don't hurt you, do they? It'll probably be hard, I mean, it's fine with me, but others, the family, it may be very hard. What made you decide that? When did you know? Don't you think it's just a phase? Won't people try to hurt you? What about marriage and kids? And what will people think about us? What if your father's coworkers finds out? Are you sure? Maybe you need to think about it. Maybe you'll change again. Maybe you should see a therapist. I love you. I really do. I mean, you've been through so much already to see this. It's such a shame. Are you sure? So I remember like sitting there and I was like, how do I begin to unpack that as a 17-year-old? Right? Is this my mom loves me still? Is this my mom has got to come to terms with my identity and how do I help her do that? And over the years, that was an interesting thing. Or is this I'm worried for my son's safety and I'm worried at the same time about what the family, right? The social structure, how that might change. So it's really interesting. Again, this is, late 90s, so things have, of course, changed since then. But I can't help but wonder if that story could be shared even by youth today. And then I met Jazz. So it's funny, before you all got here, I was chatting with Sadie and she's like, "Oh, Jazz, I love Jazz." So I got to meet Jazz actually about 4 years, I think, 3 years after this video was made. And it was really great. It was like a symposium kind of like this, but in person. So I just want to share with you, if you haven't or know about Jazz, Jazz was one of the first people who identified as transgender to essentially get into the mainstream with children's books. Which I think is great. And you'll also hear how even with Katie Couric doing this interview with Jazz, how even words and the way that they go through this conversation has even changed beyond that space. So let's take a look at this video.
This is kind of our haul of family photos. This is me the last year of preschool being presented as a boy, and the first year of kindergarten when I'm finally able to look like a girl. I was never a boy, I always was a girl in my heart, and although I was presented as male to the public, inside I was feminine. It was okay to be that because that's just who I was and I can't change that. I was born that way. I am Jazz. For as long as I can remember, my favorite color has been pink. My second favorite color is silver, and my third favorite color is green. My best friends are Samantha and Casey. We like high heels and princess gowns, or cartwheels and trampolines. But I'm not exactly like Samantha and Casey.
On the surface, Jazz Jennings seems like your typical teenager. But when she was just 5 years old, Jazz was one of the youngest people to ever be diagnosed with gender dysphoria. Now 14, Jazz has joined the growing number of transgender authors who are sharing their stories. I Am Jazz, released just last month, is one of the first transgender books created for children.
This is a children's book about your story. Why did you want to write it?
I wanted to write this book so I could help other kids who are really struggling to find out who they are. It's not geared towards just LGBTQ kids, but kids of any difference, of any type.
I think some people, Jazz, probably have the point of view that it's impossible to determine your gender identity at such a young age. And they might say, this is just a phase. I'm curious what you would say to people who believe that.
It wasn't a phase. People say that age 2 is too young to identify what gender they are. And to me, that's incorrect because at 2 years old, you're wearing girl clothes or boy clothes and you're gravitating towards different dolls. And for me, it was just a little bit different. I went down a different path and it wasn't encouraged by my parents at all because this is not a choice. This is just the way I was born. This is who I am, and I didn't make myself this way.
When you look at these pictures, I imagine it probably stirs up some tough memories. You took Jazz to a psychiatrist when she was 3 years old. Why did you do that, and what happened there?
The doctor confirmed what I already knew at home. She said, definitely that your child's transgender. But at the time, it was just so heartbreaking because I was so scared for her future. What would become of my child? How would the world accept her? And those were tough times.
How were you able to accept that your little boy was in fact a little girl?
I really didn't care what she was. I just wanted her to be happy. This is what was going to make her happy. We were going to do it.
Although still just a theory, many researchers are trying to prove that gender identity is genetic. Some scientists suggest a hormonal imbalance in the womb can cause the wrong gender imprint, while other studies indicate that gender identity may be directly associated with brain anatomy. While science attempts to explain the biological reasons for gender dysphoria, some believe it is a social choice that should not be afforded special rights.
I know at school they initially asked you to use the bathroom in the nurse's office instead of the regular bathroom. And how did they explain that to you, and how did it make you feel?
I just thought I should be able to use the bathroom I want and I could lock the door and it'll be okay. But people don't think like that. They think black and white. They don't see the rainbow in the world, and it's really just closed-minded.
I strongly believe there will be cases of rape.
We will not be told how, when, and where to raise our children.
It seems there's still a lot of resistance, though, in many communities. The Minnesota Child Protection League has questioned whether transgender kids should be able to use the bathroom or play on the sports team of their choice. What do you think of that?
It's all about education. If you go and you read up on it and learn and care enough to want to learn what this family's going through, and these kids have had a rough enough time.
I told Jazz that I thought she was so lucky to have parents like you and your husband, because as we know, a lot of parents just wouldn't accept this in a child. Have you heard about those cases?
All too well. I know so many families that are not accepting. They'll write to me and they'll say, I just can't do this. I can't give up the idea of my son or daughter. And it's really heartbreaking, and I try to tell them that this is a life and death situation. The suicide rates are astronomical here.
Do you hear from other transgender children who, because you've been so public, have reached out to you? And I'm curious what kinds of stories they tell you.
I get many emails from a lot of different kids. Some people even write that without me, that they would have killed themselves. One kid said that they were gonna walk into a street full of cars and they decided not to because they thought of Jazz. That shows me that I'm doing the right thing being here and that I have to continue moving forward.
It seems like this is a real moment where people are feeling much more comfortable talking about transgender children, transgender adults, whether it's the show, Transparent.
Are you saying that you're going to start dressing up like a lady all the time?
Honey, all my life, my whole life, I've been dressing up like a man. This is me.
Laverne Cox, of course.
You need some of these. I made my own. Couture. Commissary don't carry a size 13.
Duct tape?
Metallics are very in this season.
As you see this unfold, what do you think of it, Jazz?
Although I haven't been around for a while, I'm still pretty young. I know that there's been major progression since the time I was born. And to see the issue of being transgender finally come to the limelight, it's just amazing.
You recently were named one of Time Magazine's 25 most influential teens of 2014. What was that like for you?
That was really neat because to see that showed me that I'm being listed with all these amazing people. Malala, the Nobel Peace Prize winner, I was like, yay! Like, normally I don't do that.
There have been a lot of people supporting Jazz. People like Jennifer Lawrence and Bill Clinton. They were both anxious to meet her.
Yeah, it's surreal. We think of ourselves as just an ordinary family, and every now and then we're in extraordinary situations where these things will happen, and I'm so proud of her. I have no words. There's no word to describe the pride.
I think she's pretty proud of you.
Yeah, sometimes.
Oh, that's true. She is 14.
Yes, exactly.
I just want to provide any thoughts that you had about jazz or reactions to that, or even that idea that it's interesting how mental health and mental health professionals have some, it's kind of sad, but the DSM-4 and gender dysphoria has contributed to how kids are seen, and this idea that it in fact is a mental health condition, or was, and required some kind of an intervention. But even that idea of gender dysphoria, and in that video too, where they were talking about the helix and how DNA somehow causes, or that it's considered to not be normal, or like a congenital condition, right? That idea that it shouldn't be there. And I was even worried when we learned that there were some genetic differences, and I call them differences and not rights or wrongs, because at the end of the day, I'm worried that we would change it. We would find a way to get rid of that genetic piece, or that genetic marker, and essentially alter people's genes. So it would eradicate the biological aspect and not the social aspect. I don't know if anyone else has thoughts there.
Just super bummed that we seem to be not progressing, going a little backwards. And you're right. I think if they could fix it, right, they would. And who's to say that there's anything wrong with these kids?
Yeah.
They're just different.
Yeah. Yeah, and again, I've been around just a little bit of time, right? I'm in my 40s, but it's interesting to also know that yes, there's some backtracking now, but if I look back in time to even kind of the women's liberation movement, and then we look at kind of like Black rights movement, and just the civil rights movement, and then later on kind of the gay rights movement. With all of those efforts, there's usually some kind of pushback. We get further and there's pushback. It's of course a little bit more push at this point, but I even remember during the Reagan years, Anita Bryant and her push to essentially eradicate, individuals who were gay and lesbian, and again used kind of the Christian centric formula to do that. So I guess I'm looking at that now and going, I've seen this before. This is an easy playbook, and it'll actually come out better later, but it doesn't feel that way. So I guess I'm hopeful that it will. And I'm holding on to that, and I'm trying to work with the youth who are seeing this, right? Or when I'm going to New York on January 1st of the new year, and I'm a little worried that when the Stonewall, memorial is not going to be there. It is, but it's no longer protected, so things like that. I'm worried about the eradication of the culture and the history. But again, that's why I started Fox Valley Pride and try to keep it alive in a way. Okay. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. Eric said in the chat, I remember seeing a documentary about trans people having to be diagnosed with a mental health condition to transition when I was a child. The families were all upset and harassing them. That documentary, for a number of reasons, scared me from looking into my identity for many years. Glad there's more representation now, though safety is a still concern in this administration.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks for sharing. And I mean, it's hard to not talk about these things and not use politics, because politics governs these markers and these identities and whether people can or cannot get services and things. But I do know, there's the lavender scare is a historical piece, and McCarthyism was part of that as well. And then the 80s was back again. And is this another time of that? Absolutely. And so, how do we band together and help support both youth and then kids and families, and then just ourselves and our own families? But how do we support even adults in this space as they move about? The other thing, when you think about it, this is a really great graph. There are about 150,000 kids that identify as transgender across the nation. And this is one of those things I had to even combat with my own family around transgender identity in sports. And, at the end of the day, of the 150,000 kids, which is still a significant number, and it's probably even higher now, but then there's the number of kids who actually want to play a sport and that actually engage in it. And so when we get to the number, we end up legislating for about 8,000, maybe 10,000 kids. And if we really want to be like almost half the kids that identify as transgender and our youth who want to play sports, let's just say it was 75,000. We're legislating for 75,000 people. I'm trying to think of another time in which we've ever done that. I can't think of one. So it's also very interesting why the target is happening in that space. I'll also share, and I think this is important to be aware, if you're not, that there are even people in the LGBTQIA2S+ community, and particularly, they want to remove the T from that designation. They want to essentially don't believe that individuals who are trans and the LGBTQ community fighting for them, it should be separate and different. And I just want you to be aware that that in and of itself feels like infighting. I am not a believer in that. I believe that I had people fight for me, and I will fight for people that are also, have a different identifier and might be different and persecuted. But that's my social work value. But recognizing that even in my own community, it's been difficult to hear that from people within my own community. And just recognizing that could also be true, and maybe you won't know that. And it might be good to ask if we're going to refer people for services, or recognize that just placing like a foster child with a parent, or parents that are gay, doesn't necessarily mean that being transgender will actually be welcomed. You hope, but you don't know. So asking those questions would be helpful. All right, so we have an identity. We know about all these terms. Let's talk about what happens next. So we do know there's a coming out process, and that happens throughout all their lives. In fact, just coming onto this, session, I told all of you, it's funny. I do a lot of training for court officials, particularly in Wisconsin, where I meet with lawyers and attorneys to get them to have trauma-informed courtrooms. And I'll say, my husband and I, and I'll bring up my history but I've come out now to, 45 more people. So it never ends. It's just kind of always there. I'm also an elected official, and so that kind of comes up, and it's interesting in those spaces when I knock on doors. We also know there's homophobia, and I wanted to share with you, I'm not sure if you're aware, there's actually a scale of homophobia. It's called the Riddle Homophobia Scale. And I just wanted to give you some more concepts and terms. But again, coming out, process by which you engage in that identity development, as you're well aware. But the Riddle Homophobia Scale helps us identify where people are. And so this was another educational moment for me to help people that are like, well, I'm an ally. And I'm like, okay, how far does your allyship go? And they're like, what do you mean? And I'm like, let's talk through that. So when we think about people who are on the pity scale, that's that, oh, I pity the fact, I'm so sorry for you that you are part of this spectrum. And then when we get to there's even repulsion is kind of in that space, which is where I feel a lot of the current transphobia is coming from. And repulsion is where people think it's a crime against nature, we're sick, crazy, immoral, those types of terms. Pity is where heterosexuality is kind of pitted up against it and considered, the gold or the diamond standard, and everything else is just worse off. So identifying, like, you can maybe put people in these categories. When we get to tolerance, right, this is when people are like, well, they're people, okay, you do your thing, but you shouldn't creep into these other spaces, right? Like marriage equality, you shouldn't really get. So there's a tolerance of it as long as it doesn't impact me or my other folks. Acceptance, right? A lot of folks are kind of in that space, like, oh yeah, okay, I like Dana. He's a good guy. Still not my choice. I don't know. I'm not going to really go to a Pride Fest. What is all that? Why do you have to celebrate? Those sorts of things. And then we get to the supportive stage. That's when people are actually interested in supporting. They might raise the flag outside their house if they're heterosexual, or they give to the cause, or they actually, wear the, mom hugs and have the rainbow flag kind of showing in those spaces. Admiration, we get to the point where being LGBTQIA2S+, people see it as it's a great strength. They understand the oppression and discrimination that we're facing. They're willing to even help other heterosexuals or other people who are oppressing see how this person could have value. So that's kind of an admiration space. Appreciation is where we have people realize, like, Alfred Kinsey was an important, person, or Alan Turing, the guy. I mean, it's so interesting to me where people are like, this hasn't existed, or these people are terrible people. I'm like, we literally could not have solved the Enigma code to fight the German Nazi war machine if it hadn't been for a gay man, Alan Turing, who we then later lobotomized, and he died by suicide in prison, essentially because of how he was treated, and his assistants, which also included females and heterosexuals. But recognizing, like, we would not have ended World War II when we did had it not been for this person. And that's appreciation, right? That's appreciation for the culture. And then nurturance is like, the world could not exist without it, right? They're indispensable. They're important, just like everyone else in a way. And so just like thinking through, where are you and where are the people on this scale? This is a really good one. I think parents go through in their development. Perhaps sometimes people start at a different area, right? They're just like, oh, I'm always in acceptance. But recognizing, again, there's these steps. So this is the Riddle homophobia scale. And I want to also identify, there are some spaces where transphobia shows up, and there's some research in this space around the 4 I's. And when we think about the 4 I's of transphobia, there's kind of the ideological, what culture beliefs should look like, and how what our culture thinks of that. And again, some cultures are much like, if you think about transphobia, like in cultures like China, or you think some of the Russian culture, like in Russia, and some of the cultures are much more worse actually than the United States. In fact, we're kind of modeling those two countries, where you might see that very different, like if you were in the Netherlands, for example. And then there's institutional homophobia or transphobia, where the systematic oppression, which is where we're going right now, the countries in that approach. Some states are in that space. Interpersonal homophobia, right, or transphobia, where it happens every day. I was sharing with the organizers today that this happens in my community. It's kind of funny. We just had Margaret Cho come, the comedian, this week, and it was great because I went to this comedy show in my own community, and I was like, how could they afford to bring her? I have no idea. But I was like, whoa, there's a gay person, in my community making jokes about the gay community, and the whole room was full of people that were either allies or people like me, and it was amazing. I was like in a bubble for a moment. But it was interesting because the opener also identified in the gay community and was saying, I walked down the streets of your downtown, Appleton, Wisconsin, and they said the F word towards me, right? And he was funny about it. He's like, what? I'm sorry, I didn't hear you. And so he made the person say it again. And then he's like, I'm sorry, what? And then he said it again. He's like, yes, sir. And like, it was really an interesting moment because he embraced the homophobia, because that's what we have to do sometimes. But I even shared, with him at the end of the show, I said, I feel it. I've lived here 11 years in my community. Like I said, I run the Pride Fest. I'm an elected. People know who Dana Johnson is a little bit, a little bigger fish in a small little pond. But at the end of the day, if I were to walk down the street in the city that seems a little bit more liberal, someone would inevitably roll down their window and say something to me and my husband. So it's really interesting, right? That is just people love to do that. But I want to recognize that that's something we have to prepare kids, particularly in the child welfare system, for, because they're already, and especially some of you work in like the domestic violence space, we already know that they're a targeted population already. And then we're not even talking about the intersectionality of whether there could be race, in that space, but recognizing that we have to help them see these four eyes. And these are just ways that they might even show up. And just thinking through, for me, it puts a structure to the phobia, and then it helps me figure out where do I fit in combating that. So knowing that I'm interested in policy, now I can work on both the ideological and the institutional, where many of you, if you're counselors or advocates working with individuals, you can think about the internalized and the interpersonal stuff that's happening. So gives you a chance there. And it also shows, this is a great slide to give to a foster parent or a provider of someone to say, that doesn't, like, they're like, I don't understand people who are trans and I want to support them. Be like, did you know that they face kind of these things in the world, and gives them verbiage, around it. Okay. We'll need some of that. I think many of us are probably aware of microaggressions, but just want to highlight that happens a lot, particularly in this community. I said it before, like I had someone say like, oh, why don't you just marry a woman? Or, wouldn't it just be better off if you just tried it? Those sorts of things. So a lot of times microaggressions show up. And a lot, it's interesting too, does your family accept you is a microaggression, because it assumes that they wouldn't, or that somehow I shouldn't be. So it's really kind of an interesting piece where can we rephrase that, and we can say like, talk to me about the acceptance you receive in your family, right? And so that like turns it around a little bit differently. Or I often will hear, oh my God, you guys are so cute. And I'm like, I cannot remember a time that I've ever told a heterosexual couple, like, oh, you're so cute. I don't know. So Jake, also recognizing like some of those things can really be, they seem nice, but they can end up being oppressive or in those spaces. Because it's like, why would I don't, it's very interesting. So the other thing we were talking about earlier with identity development is also, what role does media have? So I just want to ask you, what do you think? This is an actual billboard. Well, it was actually in a magazine. I don't think it was actually a billboard, but this was a national campaign. What do you think this is promoting?
I mean, it's not letting your little boy wear heels. I know that much. Don't know what else
Yeah. Sometimes I get, it must be carpet, right? Carpet cleaning or carpet. So this is actually an ad for karate lessons. Right? And so just imagine not only being the company, Roka Karate, which is this national thing, thinking that this is what they should do about masculinity and femininity, and how somehow that's related to needing to protect yourself, right? And then I think about, then you put this young boy in heels, like you're adding to not only his personal internalized homophobia in this moment, and who knows if he even knew what he was doing, right? But at that end, like, what are we doing, in those spaces? This ad is probably one of the most successful ads for this company. And it was a big billboard in the 90s and 2000s. Right? So not only are we objectifying women, but on top of that, this helped Wonder Bra sell the most Wonder Bras in the period of which this was advertised. And this was a national campaign on billboards. So just want to highlight that. This one probably was the one that made me irate the most. So this was the national buzz-free prom advertisement. So if you can see, go from prom king to queen in 3 shots or less. So this was sent to school districts. These posters hung in schools to help stop drunk driving during prom. So again, some assumptions here, also some assumptions about what happens when you go to prison, and just the play on words. Again, I don't know who approves these things, but clearly someone from my community was not in the room where it happened. All right, so as we move forward, personal identity development, I just want to touch really quickly on what it's like to move into the world, right? This is from my wedding, and recognizing what it's like to move into community development and how we help in that space. So as a person, as an ally, as someone in the child welfare system, it's possible that we might work with children who haven't come out. It's possible that we have providers that don't understand what that process looks like and helping them through that, whether that's teaching or having conversations with youth. Do you know how to have that? And so thinking through some of these questions, like, is it possible that someone wouldn't want to come out? And how would we work with the youth when we are a staunch ally of this community and they say they don't want to do that? And then do without holding any kind of a belief system that they should. So not a forceful piece. And also thinking, knowing when is the right time to do this. And I want to share, if you've seen this video too, Jackson Bird is going to share with us too what it's like for them, particularly as a trans individual, to come out and that experience. So let's take a look at this video, because all these questions, you can kind of hear how Jackson feels we should help in that process.
Hi, I'm Jack, and I'm transgender. Let me take a guess at some of the thoughts that might be running through your head right now. Transgender, wait, does that mean that they're actually a man or actually a woman? Wonder if he's had the surgery yet. Oh, now I'm looking at his crotch. Look to the right, that's a safe place to look. Yes, I knew it. No real man has hips like those. My friend's daughter is transgender. I wonder if they know each other. Oh my gosh, he is so brave. I would totally support his right to use the men's bathroom. Wait, but how does he use the bathroom? How does he have sex? Okay, let's stop those hypothetical questions before we get too close for my comfort. I mean, don't get me wrong, I did come here today to share my personal experiences being transgender, but I did not wake up this morning wanting to tell an entire audience about my sex life. I mean, of course, that's the problem with being trans, right? People are pretty much always wondering how we have sex and what kind of equipment we're working with below the belt. Being trans is awkward. And not just because the gender I was assigned at birth mismatches the one I really am. Being trans is awkward because everyone else gets awkward when they're around me. People who support me and all other trans people wholeheartedly are often so scared to say the wrong thing, so embarrassed to not know what they think they should, that they never ask. And part of what was so nerve-wracking about coming out as transgender was knowing that people wouldn't know what I meant. And when someone comes out as gay, people know what that means. But when you come out as trans, you have to face the misconceptions that will color other people's impressions of you even after you've educated them. And you will have to educate them. When I came out, I wrote a 10-page encyclopedic document with a zip file attachment of music and videos that I sent to every single person I came out to. And I kept in my email signature for months afterwards, because you also don't ever stop coming out. I came out to the accountant helping with my taxes and the TSA agents who didn't know which one of them should pat me down, the man or the woman. I mean, I just came out to everyone watching this. When I came out to my dad, to my great relief, he was totally cool with me being trans. But as soon as I started talking about physically transitioning, he freaked. And I quickly realized it was because he, like so many other people, think that physical transition means just one thing: the surgery. Now listen, if there were one magical surgery that could turn me into a tall, muscular, societally perfect image of a man overnight, I'd sign up in a heartbeat. Unfortunately, it isn't that simple. There are dozens of different gender-affirming surgeries, from chest surgeries to bottom surgeries to facial feminization and man sculpting. Many trans people will only ever undergo one procedure in their lifetime, if that. Maybe because they don't personally feel the need, but also because they're expensive, and health insurance is only beginning to cover them. Instead, the first step for a trans person seeking physical transition is usually hormone replacement therapy. Hormones are why I have a deeper voice and some sparse whiskers on my neck and a giant pimple on my chin. Basically, they put you through a second puberty. It's a blast. Now, because our transitions are slower and steadier than historic misconceptions can lead people to believe, there can be some confusion about when to call someone by their new name and pronouns. There's no distinct point in physical transition at which a trans person becomes their true gender. As soon as they tell you their new name and pronouns, that's when you start using that name and pronouns. And I know it can be difficult to make the change. You might slip up here and there. I've slipped up myself with other trans people. But I always think to myself, if we can change from calling Puff Daddy to P. Diddy, and if we apologize profusely when we use the wrong gender pronoun for someone's pet cat, I think we can make the same effort for the real humans in our lives. Now, there is no topic that makes other people more awkward about trans people than public bathrooms. The bathrooms, the latest political flashpoint for LGBT opponents. Here's a fun fact about bathrooms. More US congressmen have been convicted of assaulting someone in a public bathroom than trans people have been. Now, the truth is, we trans people are so much more scared of you than you are of us. It is a huge point of discussion in trans communities about which bathroom to start using and when, so we don't attract attention that could lead to violence against us. I personally started using the men's room when I started getting confused and frightened looks in the women's room, even though I was petrified to start going into the men's room. Often we opt to just not go to the bathroom at all. A 2015 national survey of trans people found that 8% of us had had a urinary tract infection in the past year as a result of avoiding restrooms. These bathroom bills aren't protecting anyone. All they're doing is ensuring that when trans people are assaulted in bathrooms, the law will no longer be on our side when we report it. Being trans means a daily onslaught of these misconceptions. And I have it pretty easy. I am a white, able-bodied guy sitting nearly at the peak of Privilege Mountain. For non-binary people, for trans women, for trans people of color, it is so much harder. So I've given you a starter pack of trans knowledge that I hope will lead to more learning on your own. Talk to trans people. Listen to us. Amplify our voices. Take the heat off of us and educate those around you so we don't have to every time. Maybe someday when I say, "Hi, I'm Jack, and I'm transgender," the only response I'll get is, "Hi, nice to meet you." Thank you.
Wanted to offer up anyone who wanted to share any thoughts from seeing that, or questions, or even experiences that you have had in that space before I keep on moving.
Just that it is important to understand why they won't or can't come out, right? I have a kid, she can't come out because her family's Hispanic and very, machismo, and it's dangerous for her, so when we're in session, I can use her preferred name and pronouns, but I have to remember that when I walk her out, it's a completely different kid, and so it's tough, and and I keep it out of their notes, and it's just like it's a tough position to be in, but you have to understand why, and what the plan is for the future for this kid in particular. That's something we talk about a lot, but like, I'm sorry that you can't live as your authentic self, right? But when the choice is that or death, right? Or, ostracization from the family, it's like, okay, we got to do what we got to do. So we got to
Yeah, and you bring up a very interesting point that is been a discussion kind of around the ethics of like notes, in that, that idea too of should we document in a person's like in the pronouns essentially that they're identifying, or will there be trouble with that? Would that cause issues later on, whether it's someone wants to do something against the department or organization, for maybe supporting something that that parent didn't want to? So it's been really interesting to figure out what to do in those spaces and how to support, while at the same time, could we face litigation? For doing that. I don't have an answer for you today. It's just something that I've been hearing particularly now.
Yeah.
We're also thinking about it in child welfare too because of funding, right? And thinking through like if we tell you and support our professionals in using that, being okay with using their chosen name essentially, does that lead us into troubled water?
Yeah. I mean, I usually, if they're old enough to consent, I'll have them consent for themselves, and keep their parents out of it as much as I can. But they're still under that parent's insurance, or, so like, sometimes it's just what's the safest way to go about doing this? And sometimes you're right, there's not an easy answer, right? Like, it's complicated.
I know a lot of professionals recently that I was in a training similar to this. They often shared, the couple of folks went back and forth, and they were like, "Well, I just again, I just use their name. I have to not document all the things that maybe were mentioned, and so it feels weird to essentially not include that. But then and could potentially hurt their future progress or case notes if they needed to transfer care and things. So it's also been really interesting how that could impact patient care. But I'll never forget when I got like a printout when I went to the doctor one day and I got this thing, and the category that they had given me on this coding, I can't even remember what it was, but it basically said, I think it said something like, I'm a high risk homosexualized behavior being or something like that. And I'm like, I don't even know what that means, right? I don't even know. And then I thought, is that on my insurance? Is that like going to carry with me forever? And like, how do I remove it? And can I remove it? And what does that code end up meaning for anybody? So it was really, I don't even know what to say to it. I remember though writing, and I do believe they removed it, but it was just like one of those things that I'm like, why does this exist? So yeah, high risk. Yeah. I think it might have to do for sexually transmitted diseases or something, but I don't have any idea because those aren't the same. Just being identifying doesn't mean that I'm suddenly at risk. I don't get it. But that's old world thinking. So, all right, what to do if someone comes out to you? A lot of us might, already know these answers, but just kind of the 101, listen, be supportive. It's their story essentially, right? So they're telling you, you should keep that very confidential in those spaces. These are questions that I often, give, whether it's to foster parents or people who are in the system who don't know, like, what do you do? Just really good, easy questions. If you came out, how would your, and then insert person, react, right? And so it just gives them a chance to process through that. Do you have any friends, starting to think about their support structure, in that space, or what would be the implications? Like if we knew someone was struggling with that socialization piece of marriage and kids and pressure or something like that, like, so helping them process through kind of what happens later in that Dia Gelli's status of where they're in that process. The other thing is, we often, we know that kids come in and out of our system or come into our client system and then leave. How do we potentially offer continuous support or make known to the community that we are, in fact, an affirming kind of a place? There are some places like my organization we don't we publicize like people who sponsor our organization on our festival website, but we take it down every year and then re-enter new ones. But the other thing we do know businesses, and we do know people who have said that they affirm care. And if I get someone asking me, I will let them know, like, this is a place. But most places won't have those online, at least in my state, because they're worried that they will be targeted. And so recognizing too that sometimes there are private books or listings of businesses or organizations that can help people. And maybe if you're one of those organizations, to know that that does exist, to get your name on there so that people can continue to receive affirming kind of space. Okay. I do want to talk about too, just some policy things. So I'm going to skip ahead just a couple things, but recognizing that LGBTQ plus youth face a higher bullying kind of prevalence of it, and recognizing how do we support these particular youth in those settings. We also know they face discrimination, whether that's in the classroom by their teachers or by students, or just by even the content that's delivered sometimes, or how, as we know, bathrooms are a piece, but even just how kids are introduced in classrooms or work in groups, those sorts of things. So let's talk about it. You guys, California's always kind of been on the forefront of a lot of LGBTQIA2S plus legislation and protection. And so, yay, I'm excited for you. Kind of wish I was there, sort of an experience. But also recognizing that if we see kids who are not wanting to attend school, maybe we see grades kind of slipping. These were all, I could literally tell you that these were all check boxes for me, right? And even to the point of potential, contemplating, suicidal ideation type of an experience. But if these are usually common warning signs, right? I don't want to go to school on a Monday because I know that on Monday morning I have this particular class and I get ridiculed every day, right? Those sorts of things. We also know there are higher kind of prevalence of SAD or hopelessness, suicidal ideation, and then of course attempting. And how do we continue to protect kids? The Trevor Project is one of my go-tos for things, as well as NAMI or NAMI, National Association of Mental Institution, not mental institution, mental. Oh my gosh. I just forgot what the I stood for, but you know what I'm talking about. And so like recognizing there are other places you can get this. The Trevor Project, actually, I don't know if you know, they've recently been using artificial intelligence to help train mental health professionals to help respond to folks in the LGBTQIA+ community who might call a crisis line. Now, the good news is it's really great because they don't have to use youth to do that. They're using this AI technology, which is really, I actually sat down with the people developing the AI tool because have a training on AI too, but and it was just really cool how this has been developed to use affirming terms. Sad news, they lost the funding under the new administration, the federal administration, for this, but the Trevor Project is trying to expand with mental health awareness and assistance and services. So look for maybe perhaps in a few years some expansion in that space. We also know there's lots of other training you can take to showcase if you're an ally, like the Safe Zone training is kind of one of the benchmarks that helps people in that space, helping people get access to culture, particularly youth and health information. We know that a lot of school districts don't teach health information related to this community, or there's been kind of a pullback of that material. We might need to help find those resources while having those careful conversations with parents. Which is interesting because technically in the child welfare system, when I'm working with youth from the county or state perspective, we generally have jurisdiction. So we can provide that information to youth without repercussion. Now, granted, parents might be frustrated with me, but they're on a court order with us, or they're on a CHIPS order, Child in Need of Protection Services. So I can provide that information, and I can actually use that. I can say, well, statute says I have to share information with kids of how they identify. So it's in there. All right. Last but not least, just a couple of things I talked about. This isn't the last time that we're going to face persecution in the LGBTQ community. It's not the only time, and it's not, there are possibilities to get over it. If you don't know a lot about the history, 1969, yes, sure, the Stonewall riots was kind of the impetus to big political change, but there were even things happening before that where there were people standing up in those spaces. Recognizing we used to call this a character disorder, then we called it gender dysphoria, and now there's all sorts of things that people have into it. Time magazine first featured their first gay man in the 1960s, right after the Stonewall riots. We also know Harvey Milk was elected the first out person as the city administrator down there in San Francisco. So just recognizing a lot of these things led to the current modern day. But I also just want to highlight, and I make this connection with what happened with COVID, where we were very quick, because it was like this thing that affected many nations, quick to find a vaccine, even though they were sort of in development for other things. But we were quick to move through trying to protect people. But when AIDS kind of came out and HIV came out, it took until a youth essentially through a blood transfusion, contracted. It took 3 years for anyone to actually say we're going to do anything about it, even though it was killing people across the U.S. And in fact, it wasn't until 1986 that medication was actually, we funded it. So think about that for a second. Like 5 years after we learned about this thing, did we actually provide any funding to think about preventing it? And we also know now the United States has eliminated funding for all AIDS and HIV prevention and intervention in the number one hotspot in the world, in Africa, which again will kill people. That's the end game there. And so thinking about, what do we do about that? I don't have an answer. Just want you to think about what will that mean for us as people in general, I guess. So it's kind of interesting space. Also want to highlight just some laws, right? So laws identified for kids. These are some of the, goods, bads, or other pieces, but just identifying that states differ. Give you a second here. There are many bads on this particular slide. I think about in Wisconsin, for example, renters can be dismissed for being transgender. There's a few counties where they can't. They're on there. We have 72 counties, so just identifying that there are more counties that people can be discriminated against because of it. We also know that the number of LGBTQ individuals are rising. I shared that at the beginning of our day, because there's more people, because we have acceptance and supportive services. So when people start saying it seems to be a bigger deal, it's actually not a bigger deal. It's just, it's because there's love and support in that space. And why wouldn't we want more people to be who they are in those spaces? I do want to share, last but not least, kind of what has happened in California. So I'm going to go through some of these things. If the box is filled in, whether that's a circle or the half circle, that means that you have it. And if it's blue, it's good. If it's red, it's not good. And then there's some things I'll share with you about laws that are impacting youth and particularly youth in the space. So as you can see here, you have a lot of pro-equality laws where a second parent can adopt. Wisconsin, they cannot do that. You have surrogacy protections. You have foster care non-discrimination protections, right? All of these things. You also do not have a prohibition of surrogacy, and you do not have sodomy laws. You do not have HIV/AIDS criminalization laws. And you know a lot of this, but I just want to highlight that you fill all the blue. Yay for that. And you also have pro-equality laws around employment or housing, that idea that you can't discriminate against it. Not necessarily, I can't say that it doesn't happen, and I don't know the landscape. You guys could share that today. But jury selection, it can't be a question that's asked during jury selection, which is not true in Wisconsin. People can know your marital status. They can know the gender of the person you're married to. It's very interesting. in those spaces. You also don't have a state religious freedom restoration act. In some states around you do, right? That idea that if I claim that I have, it's kind of a religious exemption, essentially, that you have to allow me to discriminate in that space. Now, certainly on the national level, we are finding that organizations can challenge that. We found that in Wisconsin for years and years and years. I've been challenging this in child welfare. We get federal dollars to support adoption. And those federal dollars trickle into the state, and then the state contracts with private partners. And so we have Catholic Charities, for example. Catholic Charities says that LGBTQ parents cannot go to their organization and adopt youth. And I thought, well, that seems weird that you can get federal funding that doesn't allow you to discriminate, and then you can get it from our state and then essentially discriminate. And the answer there is it's a religious exemption. Now in California, you might not, that might be different for you, but in Wisconsin, they can still do that. And just like I've been asking why we still would allow the contract, but I don't seem to get very far in that space. You also have a lot of anti-bullying laws, school suicide prevention policies. You have protection against people being able to provide conversion therapy. Again, in Wisconsin, we have some jurisdictions, like my city, for example, has protection against conversion therapy ban. But the moment you step outside city limits, you can use conversion therapy on youth. And so you can see Wisconsin, not a lot of blue. I just highlight because as we think about what should be on the national level and as advocates or supporters for this community, how can we help elevate things to not be states' rights versus what we can do to help support things from a federal level? And how can we take the California model, for example, and think about having politicians and whoever work towards that possible future peace in that space. Some things here related for our trans folks and care and love. Oh, sorry, I went too fast. And last but not least, I just want to share one last video with you. Individuals kind of in the higher ed space and people who are in college and thinking about that next level of identity once people kind of move into the professional space and for us to think about. Last video, and then I'll open us up for questions, thoughts, comments, cares, and concerns.
My mom, when I told her I was gay, actually took me to like a psychiatrist. And I remember coming out and the psychiatrist being like, "There's nothing wrong with your daughter. She's perfectly healthy." And I was like, "Yeah." And my mom was like, "No."
Watching TV, you see a lot of fairy tales, and you see men and women getting married. You hear it in songs. Just everything. You're surrounded by like hetero norms. So I was really trying to mold myself into what a straight man looks like. A lot of it's kind of a blur because I was trying to be someone other than me.
It was just like kind of like a transition from like, I'm a tomboy to like, oh, I'm like really, really different.
I had a best girlfriend, a friend that's a girl who's my best friend. And about the same time that I came out, she did as well. And it was just really helpful to have two people doing that at the same time, and it kind of brought us closer together.
Even when I was coming out, like, I still had the things that I've heard from like friends and family growing up about, gay people. There were still those attitudes left over in my mind, so I had to like really educate myself and immerse myself into that community and that world.
I've been more comfortable with talking about it, but it's still not something that I'll come out and say, "Hi, I'm Jen, I'm bi." One of my closest friends, I had been talking to her about how I had been dating a girl, and I really thought she was really cute, but I also liked a guy too, and she said, she got really fed up with me, and she said, "Well, you have to pick sometime, like whichever one you're gonna be with. What does their gender have to do with how I feel about them?"
When people find out you're gay, like it raises something in them. They feel endangered. They want to change you.
And I've even had a priest once in high school tell me that, I need to redeem my life in my sociology class in front of the whole class. And I had an argument with him. Speaking up for myself publicly was a really, really empowering moment for me at such a young age.
There are so many different colors on the LGBTQ spectrum. There's trans, there's, lesbians, bi, gender fluid, gender queer. There's so many subgenres of people that exist in our community.
At the end of the day, I really had to accept that there wasn't really a single subculture that was gonna define me. I had to accept that I was made of all of these things and that all of these identities don't necessarily make me.
Be accepting of yourself, even though other people might not do it. Maybe I lost a few Facebook friends over it, but at the end of the day, that's okay.
How you feel is not what everyone says that you are. I know that sounds a little confusing.
You're gonna have to own it. You're gonna have to get your spoon, and you're gonna have to dig down deep and be like, all these layers are mine. And the sooner you do it, the sooner you'll really know yourself.
All right, so just want to open anything up for questions, comments, things you want to add. I know we are at time, but just wanted to offer a space for folks and also to say thank you for attending. And hopefully there was a nugget or something you could take away. Maybe there's some gentle reminders or some pieces there for you, and hopefully some more tools for your toolbox.
Dana, just want to give a quick thank you as an LGBT advocate. I love when I can find even like new resources that I haven't seen before, and I feel like I've seen some of that in your presentation, and the way you're presenting has been excellent, and I just really appreciate your time.
Thanks, Eric. And Sadie went ahead and put into the chat, there is an evaluation. If you want to fill that out and provide great feedback, that's helpful for future editing and being able to present this to other folks. Yeah, again, thank you for all that you do in the child welfare system as victim advocates and supporters in these spaces. I know it's challenging times. I think as we join and band together, we will prevail, and there will be opportunities for us to create really great bubbles around people, even in these pretty trying times. So thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much, Dana, for your time. This was a great informative training. And before we officially close out, like Dana said, Sadie did put the evaluation in the chat. Please just take a couple minutes to complete that form. And just want to extend also a huge thank you to our advisory committee for helping shape today's session. And if you're interested in becoming part of the committee, you're welcome to. Feel free to reach out to me. But overall, while we still have Dana here, the floor is still open. But if not, we'll start wrapping up. So I'll be emailing everyone shortly after the symposium with the PowerPoint resources and today's recording. And we really appreciate you joining us today and for the important work that you continue to do across California, and also Dana, the amazing work you do in Wisconsin. So thank you again. Looking forward to the next symposium.